Hi, everybody. In this session, we step outside of the schools domain and look at the journey this year that has occurred for workplaces, with the thought that actually the parent body or the caregivers, the broader school community for schools will have undergone their own journey in the rethinking of the workplace that has happened off the back of COVID. What does that mean for schools and how they rethink their learning, and how schools message that journey over to the community who is experiencing workplace disruption? That's the topic for today. And it's a topic close to my heart because my background is 15 years in education. I was at Northern Beaches Christian School in Sydney as a teacher, high school teacher. And then we grew an innovation movement within Northern Beaches called Sydney Centre for Innovation and Learning that I was very much a part of. And I was an innovation sort of leader across the school for many years, but then we grew that into a consultancy and worked with many other schools as they were rethinking their learning, rethinking questions around learner agency, autonomy, choice, engagement, and how that, if you put that in the center and question everything, then a lot of stuff needs to be innovated. Basically, the physical learning environment needs to be innovated, technology needs to be innovated, pedagogy needs to be innovated. The rules of engagement need to be innovated. What we think of as a school DNA needs to be rethought. So I came over from an education space to a corporate space about 5 years ago, and doing what's called workplace strategy, which is when a company reinvents its workplace to change its culture and the way it succeeds. And my observation would be these are parallel worlds. School and corporate organizations, they're wrestling with the same challenges. And what often happens is that they innovate at the point of need. So many organizations are sort of in the status quo, just like many schools are in a status quo. But when there's a clear and present disruptor, that forces some greater innovation, which can unleash really good things. So COVID has in fact catalyzed some great innovations in both school and the workplace. And that's the parallel I want to explore today. And then we can hopefully have a great discussion about it. If you're interested in that school journey that I mentioned, 2 PhDs have been written about our journey at that school, and I've written a paper that recounts the developments there. So with COVID as a disruptor, it's an interesting one because many workplaces, as are many schools, are in a place of the status quo. But in many ways, COVID has acted as a forced disruptor to what's happening in the workplace. So I want to explore that now. I want to share what I've experienced this year in comparison to the last few years working with a wide range of workplaces. So I guess what we've seen this year is this forced step out of a company's comfort zone. So in some cases, very rapidly, they had to go into an adaptation mode as a lockdown came in and they had to work from home overnight or very rapidly. And then for some organizations, not for all of them, but for many organizations, they've then evolved from that adaptation phase to what I might call a reinvention phase, where they stop and think, well, how has this disruption changed what we're going to do in future? When the pandemic's over, how do we need to think differently in the long term around how we work together and how we do what we do? But I have to say, this is not evenly distributed. And in Australia, we're seeing these three phases play out very differently depending on geographical location. So it's quite different in Melbourne that experienced a second long lockdown than it is in Brisbane or Adelaide that experienced a very short lockdown, or Sydney that had a medium lockdown that then kind of is a thing of the past. So it also depends on the organisation, the leadership, etc. So some organisations went into adaptation and then have come back to the status quo, right? So it's almost like the rubber band effect, where there's no reinvention. It's just let's get back to where we were. where some organisations never even left the status quo. They never really embraced the lockdown. There are companies who didn't even embrace working from home. But there is definitely a demographic that have got over to that reinvention phase. And I guess for schools, that means that there is a significant number of parents or caregivers in that school community who have experienced a disruptive journey, and a significant proportion whose companies that they work for have gotten to that point of questioning the long-term future. That's what I want to explore now, is what that's looked like for a number of organisations and therefore parents or caregivers in a school community. And it goes something like this. When we were back in the status quo before COVID, we always worked from the office. Then, when we had to rapidly adapt, we all worked from home. And what happened when we worked from home is we had to rely on trust and we had to rely on technology overnight. Because managers could no longer manage using line of sight. They were no longer sat with their teams physically in an environment. And the technology tools like Microsoft 365 or Google Docs or the Google Suite or whatever the technologies were, suddenly they were massively relied on to collaborate and get things done overnight. And generally the technology has survived. It's done quite a good job. And generally trust, lo and behold, when you have to trust, people rise to the occasion and it doesn't fall apart. And actually people do great work when they're trusted. So that's, for companies who've worked through that, that's why this reinvention then is quite tantalizing. They're stopping and they're going, well, what's an office for? Well, like, what are we going to do in the future? Because staff who've been through this journey, they love being trusted. And, some great work is happening. And so you go, well, what's an office for? And what does this look like after COVID? So just to recap the story, the status quo, I think, for workplaces, you had safety was just a hygiene factor. The workplace, you just showed up and sat at your allocated desk in the open plan environment. Often for people, they were hindered by noise, but there was nothing they could do about that. Collaboration was something that just happened because you're all thrown together in the office all the time. And that trust and tools, that technology was untested and people were a bit wary about trust and the future was not questioned. But during this adaptation period, you had people working from home. They realized that home is great for focusing, but collaboration that couldn't happen because people weren't face-to-face eroded a little bit and became virtualized. But the tools were trusted and the future, well, people weren't really thinking about the future during that adaptation phase. Then for those companies that have got through to reinvention, they're no longer thinking about safety. They're thinking about what does it mean to thrive? They're asking themselves, what's an office for if we can survive without one? They're looking at location flexibility and trust. They're realizing that the focus that you get when you work from home needs to be balanced with the magic of face-to-face collaboration. And there's actually a drive to say, well, how do we bring people back to the office, but do so authentically, do so as a matter of choice rather than just reverting back to the status quo. We know trust and technology are no longer a limiter, so we need to model the future. What is the future of how we work together as an organization? Now, interestingly, but just a couple of points on research around flexibility. Even before COVID, the research was in around giving autonomy around where and when people work within the office or between the office and home. And actually, the best results were in high trust environments where people could choose to focus or choose to collaborate and could move to the physical space that was most appropriate for the purpose of what they were trying to achieve at that point in time. And the research since COVID hit has really reinforced that home is a great location for certain activities and the office is a great location for other activities. So this research is now sinking in for workplaces and it is causing them to stop and think. How do we set up the office and how do we set up trust and autonomy and flexibility? And generally, for companies that have gotten this far, this is kind of where it's landing. They're saying, we need to go from an office that just looks like this. Allocated desks in an open plan with a few offices for leaders, some enclosed meeting rooms, and a kitchen. And yeah, a few other spots, but really that's as simple as it gets. To this. A massive variety of choices, quiet desks that you can go to work at, desks in a noisy, bustling environment that you can work at, certainly meeting rooms, but a massively expanded kitchen with booths and collaboration spots around it, focus spots which you can go to and hide away. And then, of course, still maintaining home and places like a cafe as legitimate choices for where to work. So basically, a massive amount of choice and a massive amount of trust that allows people to focus, but then to come together and collaborate and to modulate that from moment to moment with a recognition that that's what a high performance can look like in the workplace if we get these things right. So just graphically, just recapping that, a much simpler, from a status quo of a much simpler setup with a low need to be purposeful to a massive amount of choice with a high need to be purposeful and a high need to kind of make deliberate reflective choices from moment to moment around where we're going to be and whether we're going to connect together or we're going to separate out, etc., etc. So interestingly, this move towards higher flexibility does match with a trend that I have been observing anyway, and we've been observing in our consultancy for quite some years anyway. And this is an aspiration for companies to go from the bottom of these four cultural quadrants to the top, and certainly from the bottom left to the top right. And we're seeing this because to compete in the marketplace, organizations have got to be more creative. They have to increase the pace of innovation. They have to move from a factory of products to relational connection with clients and from intelligent competition in the marketplace. So it's that classic story of manufacturing moving to the knowledge economy and an innovative economy. So COVID has kind of just provided an adrenaline shot to the sorts of changes that a lot of companies knew they needed to make, but they just couldn't shake off the status quo. So just to then bring this to a focal point, we are definitely seeing COVID giving many workplaces, many organizations the chance certainly to go into a crisis mode, that adaptation mode, but for many of them to go into a total reinvention mode. What does that mean for schools? Let's start thinking about the discussion and the Q&A now. What does this mean for schools? It means that depending on where you are in the world and what's happened with lockdown and where companies and organizations are up to, that there may be a huge appetite in the school community, a school community that is often, it's often conservative, isn't it? Many parents and caregivers are conservative in their approach to their kids' education. They don't want people to innovate with their kids' education because nobody wants to gamble or risk their kids' experience, which is of course massively problematic when schools are so broken. And so what's happened with COVID is I reckon there's a chance that many school communities will have a real receptivity in that school community to come back to some questions around why. Why do we do school the way we do? How do we allow kids to focus? How do we allow kids to collaborate? How do we allow them to have trust and autonomy as they navigate the collaboration and the learning environment? And maybe a real receptivity to rethinking a lot of the school DNA that's previously been locked down because parents are too scared to change it. If parents are going on a pretty transformative journey in the workplaces or the school community is, maybe they'll be more receptive to some great school innovations. Maybe now's the time to do a parallel rethink. What do you reckon? Let's have a great discussion. Let's move into a Q&A now.